I wanted to start with the recent article you put out, fairly recent, Criticism's Biggest Straw Man, because in it you're engaging with the so-called poptimism wars, which I see as a little bit of an analog of the culture wars in a way, right? It's
Hmm.
about like, broadly speaking, it's about like how the arbiters of taste feel like they need to sort of take a stand against, I feel like, some kind of slippage in our standards around what counts as good music. And I want to ask you about that question of like what good music is, but if we can even make that kind of assignation, or if we make an asset of ourselves in making that assignation. It's a brilliant long article, and points out that like these, it's cyclical. The poptimism wars has a cyclical quality, and it seems to be occasioned by a New Yorker writer taking pretty aggressive positions about poptimism. You quote Sene as saying that poptimism dictates that critics should not just take pop music seriously, but celebrate it or else. And I wanted to ask, like, is it really specifically the or else part of that that feels almost nonsensical to you in this whole debate? That idea that, like, we kind of don't have any choice, I guess.
Yeah, I mean the or else part was where I felt like it got silly because the question is like, what are these consequences
Mm.
that Califo was referring to with that? But I think it's also like a misunderstanding of the idea of poptimism. And again, I should say that one of the things I'm trying to argue in that whole piece is also that I don't think poptimism is actually a currently particularly relevant framework. Um, Except in the way that people continue to want to fight about it. This is like a 25-year-old debate that a lot of us felt was sort of well dealt with by about 10 years into that cycle. But the backlash to it continues. But yeah, when Khalifa says that the idea was to have critics not only take pop music seriously, but in some kind of mandatory way to celebrate it. Like that second part is just not there. The only really important part about the initial idea I felt was that taking pop music seriously the same way that you take any other form of music seriously, and that it's the job of the critic and hopefully of the sort of open-minded listener never to dismiss a whole realm of cultural activity in that way, whether it's a genre or a form or, the music that for whatever set of reasons happens to be um, the kind of music that's being played on the radio in whatever era you're in. And the only reason to make that argument, because I think really, if you look at music history in general, it's self-evident. The reason to make it is because there's always been, but particularly in the sort of late 90s and early 2000s, among critics, there was a tendency to just be dismissive of pop as a category. I was part of what my book is about is that I was part of that kind of tribe of people who were doing that. And so I looked at the conversation around poptimism as a way to rehabilitate my own knee-jerk biases. Um, in the intervening time since that conversation happened, and you can look back, there are like pieces. My friend and colleague Jody Rosen wrote a piece for Slate in I think it was probably 2009, 2010, somewhere in there, talking about the sort of poptimism wars of the time, and it's very much saying like this poptimism won. like but and the ironic thing about this whole journey between there and here is that Califo was the person who wrote the like landmark 2005, I think it was, New York Times essay about rockism that really like was the thing that took these things from being an intramural conversation among critics to something that other people than critics would know about in the first place. And I think the only reason that I felt the need to write that essay, which is sort of a long look at the whole way that this has all played itself out, which is I published it back in, I think, November, um, was that continually on social media in particular, but also in longer pieces, I keep seeing this idea of poptimism being called on to justify a set of prejudices that the writer wants to mobilize. And you're right that there's something culture warsy about it, but at the same time, it can be equally from a conservative position or a kind of righteous lefty position. Like people find their own ways to kind of say that somehow criticism has sold itself out to the forces of commerce and the power of corporate entertainment. And poptimism is used as kind of a straw man for that. And I wanted to argue that actually the things that people are usually complaining about, like Khalifa, um, criticizing the state of criticism right now, that like none of that really had to do with poptimism. It had to do with changes in the media environment, which meant that basically, as I've directly experienced, and a lot of other writers have directly experienced, as this financial state of media, particularly, has become as dire as it is, that a lot of publications, especially ones that aren't like specialized niche music publications, the only kind of coverage they will do is of famous people because that's what gets clicks, that's what gets eyeballs, and those are the only numbers that they can sell to advertisers. And so the door really narrowed on what other kinds of content, music, general interest publications, and to some extent the largest music publications are willing to include. And that's a different problem, and it doesn't have to do with an ideological shift from critics. It has to do with the industry that we work in. And that like we are struggling to make a living, and you're saying it's because we sold out. It kind of drives you insane. And again, criticism, if criticism had ever known how to sell out, it would be a whole different thing. I felt what I really wanted to do, and of course, one can never succeed in doing this, but what I really wanted to do was like write the article that would just end this conversation, that we would never talk about it again.
I do appreciate the just like generosity almost of because it's like the way you frame it, it's a bit tongue in cheek, like you want to end the conversation. That's not the impression that your writing usually leaves. Your writing is about trying to actually like reopen it and problematize things that are, I think occluding that thoughtful, critical conversation. And one of those things is absolutely this like churn of content creation, and what gets kind of sucked up by the algorithm. We're now on the precipice of like a zero click culture, right? Where like Google
Yeah.
basically just gobbles it all up and spits it out in its summary form and tries to kind of market convenience over that critical conversation. And yeah, that zero click is a zero sum game where there's not really room for careful consideration of how we rehab our own biases, to use that really lovely phrase that you used, and how we forget to do that when we're working to justify our prejudices. Like I think that is an interesting kind of distinction. But so like what's interesting to me in this whole debate, and I love that you're saying like the point is just to not dismiss a form, like to try and engage with it generously. And there's like a lot of self-awareness in your thinking about how we do need a broader view of songwriting than we casually have, as you put it on the Culture Gabfest, RIP Culture Gabfest. Um,
Yeah.
like the idea that it's about more than just a person with a guitar or a piano, that songs are written in this like manifold way, and that yeah, dismissing stuff as like not music or not good music is probably not getting us to any sort of like a richer place when it comes to the music we love. And yeah, I mean like the article is really wonderful. I think everybody should read it because it's like this archive of some of your favorite music writers. It is this attempt to really generously engage with the debate, but it's also part of this like longer lineage of trying to engage with a certain cynicism of, neither left nor right, but really a kind of still conservative cynicism that you can see in like Theodore Adorno's work. It's especially the kind of shitting on jazz that Adorno did is so weird, right? He wrote 3 articles on jazz where he's just like, this is just noise. And that didn't age well. And I think you nailed
Yeah,
it.
I mean,
Yeah, sorry,
I
go ahead.
mean, we should be careful about these things. I mean, because
Right.
among critics, um, like popular critics, like rather than sort of academic critics,
Mm,
um, Adorno's reputation like sort of centers around those jazz articles. And
mm,
first, it's important to know that when Adorno used the word jazz, he was talking about pop music. Basically, he was saying like
right.
he meant Tin Pan Alley
Mm.
jazz standard songs. The fact that he used jazz in that
Oh,
reductive way
see, I
is
didn't
like
really clock
is
that,
like
to be
a
honest.
signal of how little he knew about jazz. Like
Right.
he wasn't talking about, like New Orleans,
Mm,
like jazz bands. Like he was talking about like swing bands that were on the radio. And,
right.
so very much it was like
Yeah.
an anti-pop position. I'm not a scholar of Adorno, but I know enough about Adorno to say like that's not
Mm,
a completely reliable representation of his general cultural
right.
position. Like his argument about so-called jazz, by which he meant pop, was was that compared to what he championed, which was kind of modern experimental composition out of
Mm,
the classical tradition, so uh, Stravinsky, you know,
mm, mm-hmm,
like
mm-hmm,
that kind of generation of modernist composers who he felt were, by challenging um, conventional melodic structures, et cetera, were representing the idea of change and representing, progressive forces
mm,
against conformity and all of that kind of thing. That's on music. This is where he stood. And he was a musician himself too. So he had weird like stakes in the game. He was a composer to some degree himself, I think.
right.
But some of what he was saying is like not analogous to the anti-poptimist um, leftist position now,
Mm,
which takes the position that that pop opposes innovation and that what we need are like new voices and diverse voices coming from other places. The problem with that, of course, is that it's historically ignorant about what pop is and how pop functions and how it has functioned over the decades, and in fact has been a driver of innovation in lots of ways as much as any other kind of music,
mm,
and when we talk about music from decades past, we don't even make this distinction quite so much, like, the easy example to use is the Beatles. Like when we talk about the Beatles and what they did culturally, the Beatles were a pop band
yeah.
and
Yeah.
like,
Yeah. Yeah.
and lots of the sort of so-called revolutionary music of previous generations was pop music, but like in our own time we always to make finer distinctions and draw camps in different ways. But
Mm,
anyway, yeah, I just wanted to intervene to
I
say
appreciate it.
that
Yeah.
Adorno can be used as a bit of a straw man for these arguments, and like it's important to be a little more precise about what he was doing.
No, and I was doing that. I think, and not intentionally. I think I always just kind of had this knee-jerk kind of reaction to some of, and I think it's influenced by other folks' kind of, condemnation of Adorno's conservatism. But no, I appreciate you giving me like actually like just a much fuller sense of what he's writing out of, because of course like you don't yet have Max Roach. You don't yet have like these hard bop like, that turn in jazz,
Yeah. I mean, it
which,
was he didn't know about it. It was sort of happening around the time he wrote those things, but he
yeah,
didn't know that. And not many people knew about it yet.
right.
But like, and there was always a more experimental and like broader side to jazz through its entire existence.
Mm,
But that wasn't the part that got on the radio. That was the part you had to be in a club to see, and like, or you had to
right.
be an aficionado to see. And so like, it's easy to forget that in the mid 20th century, jazz was the dominant form of popular music
Hmm.
in a lot of ways, right? I mean, there
Hmm.
were competitors, there were like sort of ballads and crooners and various kinds of things, but all of those were kind of jazz adjacent as well.
Hmm.
Jazz was really kind of the first, well, ragtime before it, but like sort of ragtime, blues, jazz. These were the first kind of revolutions of mass produced popular music, once recording technology became available and all of these kinds of things. And,
Hmm.
so they're like, the fights around them were like pretty analogous to the fights that then later happened about rock music and the fights that
Mm,
later happened about punk.
sure.
Like this is kind of the thing that reiterates is, and then hip
That's
hop,
right.
each of these times, almost always out of Black American sources, there are
Mm.
these kind of world changing shifts in music, and and sort of, so there were jazz wars in their own way.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I find I'm kind of spinning thinking about it all, and like I just I find it tremendously interesting, and it's like there's this thing, this kernel that seems to be at the center of it, that is really compelling, and I think it's about how, like, if you look, for example, I know you're a fan of Jeff Parker and what Jeff Parker is doing right now with these improv, Happy Today and The Way Out of Easy, these improvised records that are a kind of ambient avant-garde jazz. Like, it is true that labels like International Anthem are finding a way to make a kind of anti-jazz popular again. And thinking about the fact that people care about it, that they find pleasure in listening to like, it seems to reveal something about where we're at.
Yeah.
My question would basically be like, is poptimism less inclined to draw territorial lines between what counts as good music and what is just stuff people want to have fun listening to or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, I also resist the tendency to let people enjoy things, right? Like, and of course you have to let people enjoy things. That's true, and really you can't prevent people from enjoying things. The dominant form of music criticism among like cool people before rock criticism was about jazz and then to some degree about folk. And those were considered the kind of like intellectually respectable forms of music. And rock music was considered the sort of like middlebrow, lowbrow, um, populist thing that was just what kids like to dance to and it didn't mean anything. And a generation of people who had grown up have feeling their lives changed by the advent of rock and roll. The generation of people who, as like you'll see in like 10,000 different music books, whether in musicians' biographies or in critics' biographies, the people who like saw Elvis on Ed Sullivan and like had their whole world view shaken. The white people who saw Elvis on Ed Sullivan. That, they grew up, they wanted to say, I think this stuff is serious and important. Um, and and then they proved it. Basically, they created a body of work to show how you would take that music seriously. Um, and so that kind of exercise of like what's being excluded, which always implies like who's being excluded. In the case of that, you know, action, it was sort of the like what were considered the undifferentiated mass of young people, basically, being that their opinions were valueless. By the mid 2010s or even early 2010s, the people who were reacting against the idea of poptimism were thinking of the word pop as basically representing like Katy Perry and Lady Gaga and like that whole wave of sort of like big pop sounds in 2010s music. But like in the early to mid 2000s, the thing that we were really concerned about being excluded was hip hop and R&B. And and those things were the becoming the dominant sounds in pop um, for the first time. Um, and or like in modern R&B in the first time. The amount of dismissal that you would see from a big swath of critics, particularly people who were sort of indie rock affiliated, um, had a whole series of obvious problems with it, right? That went beyond just being closed-minded. It had social implications, and also seemed insane to some degree that there was still such a persistent idea of the questioning whether rap was really music. Like all of that was still implicit in a lot of these reactions. We've fallen into calcified assumptions and knee-jerk prejudices. And so that's what made it feel necessary to have this conversation about rockism and poptimism. But the basic principle still remains is that, like, as an open-minded listener, and especially as somebody who makes any kind of claim to analyze and take the temperature of what's happening in popular culture, to sort of take the pessimist view that none of this is meaningful and there can't be any value found in it, is to just extremely limit your own purview. And also, again, to like, the one of the misunderstandings of optimism is the idea that there's like an automatic value ascribed to the idea that lots of people like something. That's that nobody's saying that that automatically means it's good, although we might be saying that automatically means it's interesting, you know, but um but there does seem something extremely insular about doing the opposite, and something insular and also sort of misanthropic about assuming that that the more people like something, the worse it must be, which was like
Oh yeah,
not an uncommon assumption, and
sure.
not just in music. There was sort of a film version of that
Yeah,
that was, like the sort of anti-blockbuster ideology
100%. Yeah.
that pervaded a lot in the 90s and 2000s, like all of these things. And then media sort of blew up and changed and the
Mm,
conversation became different. But,
hmm.
that sort of late 20th century sense of these monoliths produced this backlash reaction where we wanted to dismiss them completely.
Hmm. Yeah, wow. There's a ton there, and I'm just like scribbling
Yeah,
notes like
sorry,
what?
I get
No, it's
monologue.
fine. I'm just like I want to talk about Elvis now. I want to talk about, there's that recent Elvis documentary about his residency in Las Vegas that was incredibly eye-opening for me, which has all this archival footage about how much of a virtuoso Elvis really was in some ways,
Hmm.
and the fact that like there's a kind of stated border crossing kind of racial justice ethos in some ways, the way that he made music. It's clear that people care intensely about this. That it matters, and absolutely, I think that last point is valuable. Like the idea that there's a certain misanthropy at the heart of saying, like, if something is beloved, then it must be bad. It predisposes you to hating Charlie XCX or whatever, rather than being curious about what it was about Brat that was so profound for people. Actually,
Yeah, and it reflected like, a thing that's like much less truth now, thankfully, but certainly not completely changed, which is like who dominated the critical conversation. And, that sort of anti-mass misanthropy
Mm,
came to some degree out of the fact that like critics were in the vast majority like white nerd boys, and I'll sign on to this as well,
right.
who like had a ingrained prejudice as like smart kids who didn't necessarily groove with everything that their peers were
Mm,
into, and and whose peers didn't necessarily welcome what they were into in school.
hmm.
um
We've all known them.
kind
We've
of
all
kind of
been them at
unexamined
times.
resentment,
Yeah, I think
and like,
so.
yeah, and
Yeah,
now we have the sort of like metastasized like incel version of all of this, but like at
I
the
suppose
time we
so. Yeah.
didn't.
Yeah, yeah,
but
yeah.
like but like there was that kind of like anger
Mm,
underlying a lot of that kind of like zine culture, like
sure.
anti-popularity kind of stuff,
Yeah.
and I'll cop to having some of that psychology,
Hmm.
myself. And one of the things that I think was appealing to me about talking about it was to recognize that a little bit and try and like mature out
That's
of
it.
those kind of knee-jerk oppositions.
It's interesting because like there are advantages socially, which is what Let's Talk About Love is in part about. It's like the social advantages of coolness, the things that it confers upon you. But then it does seem like, at least in my own experience, having a kind of brazen anti-populist relationship to music seems to, I don't know if it does, help you move into musical subcultures that might challenge you in some ways, that might
Right.
open up different worlds. Like, I am a person who likes Sonic Youth, and that is the kind of person I am, or whatever,
Right.
right? I'm open to noise, but it makes you less inclined to consider things like the knee jerk. We keep using this term knee jerk, right? Like it makes you spontaneously antagonistic toward things that might actually be enriching to you, be of interest to you, you
Yeah.
know?
The book is particularly about trying to examine that antagonism, but like, and one of the things that it that I try to do is like when we realize that cool and cultural capital are so closely related and maybe are just words for the same thing, um, or social capital, these cool definitely blends both of those things. Um, then you start to say, oh, like maybe cool is kind of a trap.
Mm,
But at the same time, as you were just saying, I don't want to, you know, cool things being cool is also exciting,
yeah,
and
this is the tricky
subjective, and like
part.
people see
Yeah,
it all kinds of ways. But like, yeah, it's important. I think for me, the importance about the poptimism argument, or like the version of populism that the book kind of tries to assert, which is a little different. Like that was a counterweight to a life of spent trying to say to people, hey, like the things that are most culturally obvious for you to discover and find are not like the only things out there, and your
mm,
life can be really super enriched
mm-hmm.
by exploring a little bit outside the and towards the margins.
Yeah,
And that's what I'd been devoted to, and like I still am. Mostly that's still
yeah,
where most of my cultural energy goes. But and so I'll never stop saying that to people,
mm-hmm.
and especially as I get older, I want to say to my peers, like, there's new stuff. You don't have to just listen to things that
This
you've
is the
listened to all
thing.
your life,
Yeah,
and that becomes another argument. There's still cool new things to discover.
yeah,
So I feel like I have this very like love-hate relationship with cool on that level, where
yeah,
it is important, but it also can be a seductive factor that can, lead you to dismissing the beauty and the value that can be found in things that are not cool.
mm-hmm. Yeah, no, no question. And my mind goes to the fact that like I now am learning, about new music through my kids who are teenagers.
Right.
I might have been aware of like Geese because of apparently the fact that they spent a lot of money on digital marketing, and it worked, reportedly. Wired called it a psyop, but at the same time, that album "Getting
Yeah.
Killed," it's a good enough rock record. It's well produced. It's there's some great songs on it,
Yeah, I
and
think the whole psyop thing is also a bit of a
I agree.
it's like
It's
calling it a
clickbait.
calling it a conspiracy theory is
Yeah.
maybe too strong, but what it is to me is a naive position about the fact that many things are marketed to you.
What are you
And
talking
like,
about exactly? Like,
you know,
yeah, you think Big Thief doesn't spend money on digital marketing? Like,
yeah,
they
exactly,
absolutely do.
yeah.
It's part of just the PR
And like
side of
not
it.
not everybody who spends that money on digital marketing breaks through the way that
That's right.
Geese did. And I think Geese mostly broke through for reasons that have to do with people liking their music rather than because
Sure.
they saw them on the internet a lot. It's just like, do you need to see them on the internet for to be in the game, right? Like the people who
Yeah.
don't know how to do any kind of marketing, especially now that critics don't have that much leverage
Mm.
in the marketplace. Critics used to be kind of the counterbalance to the
Mm-hmm.
marketing.
Mm-hmm.
Not that we didn't also get things marketed to us, but there was an idea that we would discover things and bring them to people who wouldn't otherwise see them. Now
Right.
that that's much less of a factor, the people who don't have any mojo about the marketing, they don't even get a chance to compete, and it doesn't determine who wins. And
Yeah.
especially, like when radio and things like that aren't a factor. Like when radio is a factor, that starts to become much more of a big money game for sure. But like even then, it's not. Record companies bring hundreds of things to the radio every every month at this point, and like two might get any impact, and certainly very few of them become like big famous things. There's just this idea that like some, like any other business, in a capitalist society, this is how things work. And if you feel betrayed that an artist has had anything to do with that, then like don't look too closely because you won't be able to like anything practically.
Yeah. And especially, I mean, it does seem as though bands like Geese that are in this like, rock genre very clearly, trying to push it maybe a few degrees toward experimental, have to face the challenge of like inauthenticity, right? Which is
Yeah.
this Wired article that claims it's a psyop. That's the vulnerability they're kind of exploiting, is the hypocrisy of it. And maybe it makes sense to really unpack the concept of rockism in relationship to this example, because we've mentioned it a few times, and I feel as though it might be less self-evident than a term like poptimism. The way you frame its reemergence, rockism's reemergence in the early 2000s, suggests that there's a sort of nostalgic celebration of what you call like individualistic, artistic, or rebellious music, art rock, in particular, maybe. And, you mentioned like this capitalist system that hovers over and constrains, maybe in some ways, the like cultivation of these loves and these different forms of pleasure. When I read that, I was like, can we actually have this version of rockism, this tendency to like celebrate a specific sort of I feel like anti-capitalist ethos without capitalism and without the sort of disillusionment in some
Right.
ways that capitalism fosters, especially within rock's subcultures.
I would say that, yeah, it's always had a nostalgic element for sure. Um, an attachment to an ideal of rock as a thing that you've attached to at some point as representing some kind of larger set of values. And, whether it does or doesn't, it is a form of trying to find some kind of authenticity. And authenticity, like cool, is kind of a double-edged thing where it's like, to a large degree, I think it's a mirage, and, all art is constructed, and it's also all made from one point of view or another. And unless you have some kind of psychic powers, your ability to like judge how sincere somebody is and what their motivations are always limited. And like images are constructed around trying to convince you of those things, even unconsciously. Like just putting on a leather jacket is like it has a bunch of symbolic meanings that like they're trying to or invoke for you, or at least trying to invoke for themselves. So there's all of this kind of thing. I'm not saying that like all of this is again some kind of psyop. But what's important about the idea of rockism is not to say that like there's something corrupt about rock or any of that. it's taking the like external qualities that we associate with rock, whether that's certain kinds of beats or guitars or configurations of like four guys in a band, or or this idea of being anti-establishment in like a bunch of symbolic ways, of like lyrics being rebellious in some kind of like explicit sense, all of these things, which may be the things you like about rock music. They're often the things that I like about rock music too. Um, and treating them, this is my friend Douglas Wolk wrote this like in the mid 2000s, and I still think it's the best definition. Treating those as the default by which all forms of music have to be measured, right? So it's like music is better the closer it is to being like rock on these levels, and worse the further away it is from that. Um, and obviously things that seem cool in other ways, like global musics and that kind of thing, people often don't try to apply those metrics, but they will try to apply those metrics to mainstream pop music or to country music, or all kinds of forms that have their own set of values and procedures of operation and things that make them cool or not cool. And by like applying this rock lens, which there's a particular tendency among like sort of boomers and Gen X people to do, and a certain fragment of like indie oriented millennials, there's like you're just overlooking what the thing is itself, right? You just want the thing to be the thing you like, and unwilling to like discover what the qualities of that other form are. Um, and that's rockism. And there's some implicit, more nebulous, but at the same time also kind of alarming things that go along with that, which is that like all of those rock values tend to be associated with like white guys. And so there's like kind of an implicit dismissal of people who are coming from other cultural backgrounds. And there's like a sort of anti-feminine element to it, like that women are only cool if they are like tough chicks, like in a rock way, and so like I've been having conversations this week about Lilith Fair because of this new women's festival that Olivia Rodrigo is putting on this summer, that's kind of a like Lilith Fair for the 2020s. And like many of my peers and I myself remember feeling that like Lilith Fair was uncool because there were all these like chicks who were played kind of soft music. And so like totally overlooking like what a revolutionary thing it was within the industry, which really like had a bias at the time. It was like you should not have more than one woman on any given concert bill, and you shouldn't play two women in a row on the radio, and all of this kind of thing, ignoring all of that and just feeling that like Sarah McLachlan and Sean Colvin were like too lovey-dovey or whatever we thought. and and then also missing that like Sarah McLachlan actually heard those criticisms, and it was too white the first year, and she went out and like got Michelle Ndegeocello to be part of it, and got like Missy Elliott very early in her career played Lilith Fair, like all of these, and like got Chrissy Hines, so there'd be like a tougher rock chick there, and Liz Fair played all of these people in the subsequent years. But like a lot of people that I've been having that conversation with said, "Oh yeah, and I didn't pay attention after that, so I don't know that they'd changed because I just formed an idea of what it was." And like that was an implicitly rockist reaction that immediately became an anti-woman reaction, even from women who were into like cooler, who were into Sleater Kinney, and were like, "I don't want to have anything to do with this Sarah McLachlan thing." So like these are the sort of insidious ways that rockism operates, and again, also specifically in relationship to hip hop, you know, you know, judging hip hop by how much like rock it was, and the things that were less like rock, being dismissed,
Yeah.
and this idea that, real instruments weren't
Yeah.
being used and all of that kind of thing.
Yeah, that is so, it's an incredible deconstruction of authenticity at the heart of this unpacking of the kind of implicit and explicit misogyny and racism that seems to characterize a certain kind of rockism. And, there's so much that we could develop out of what you just said. I think, it's tempting also to kind of like paint with a broad brush on some level when it comes to rockism. Like there are folks that do just genuinely love Lou Reed or whatever,
Yeah,
right? Like,
yeah. And again, I'm one of
yeah,
them. Like one of the difficult,
sure, that's the tricky
the
part.
thing that the way that people take these critiques,
Mm,
and like it comes up very frequently in these like anti-poptimist backlash pieces. People will be like, "Oh, so you're not allowed to like rock," and it's like, "What are you talking about?" As I say in
that's
the
the,
in the
yeah,
poptimism piece, like at that point in like the decade tenure of my music being a music critic at Slate, I'd written 7 articles about Bruce Springsteen and like I think 6 about Bob Dylan. Like it's like this idea that like somehow I'm saying you're not allowed to like these people
right,
is just crazy. Like it's just not what the
yeah,
argument is about. It's just like you're not allowed what you're trying to encourage people to do is like not subject Taylor Swift to a test
mm,
by which the question of like how much like she's Bob is she like Bob Dylan is the most important question, right?
sure.
Like,
Try and take it on its own terms. I think like you're right that treating one particular genre as a default is inherently a kind of a problem, because you are, as you said, like overlooking the thing itself, but you're also trashing the people for whom the thing is important.
yeah.
And like a lot of for my
And
own,
sometimes the motivation
yeah,
goes the other way around too, right? Like sometimes
yeah,
people start from, I don't like the kind of people who like this,
right,
whether consciously or unconsciously.
mm,
And then that becomes how they judge the music. Like definitely there's a lot of that around country, for example. The assumptions
yeah,
about the country audience
yes.
become a judgment of what country music is.
Hmm. And you are losing out. You're losing out as a listener in castigating all of country, which, as
Yeah.
you
And
say,
you're losing out as a
yeah,
citizen,
yes, that's it.
by
And maybe
dismissing large numbers of people as some
100%.
kind of like moronic
Hmm.
bunch of robots who simply swallow whatever they're fed.
You might be missing out on having a good relationship with like your family. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like there are
Yeah.
probably
Yeah.
people in your family who are like, I absolutely love X country artists. Or like when I was growing up, I gave my sister such a hard time for loving all these boy bands, just like making fun of
Right.
her for loving boy
Yeah.
bands. She loved boy
I mean,
bands
that is a
because
that is a
you know.
teenage brother's job. But yeah, yeah, yeah.
Thank you for letting me off the hook. I still feel bad about it. But you mentioned country music a few times. Like you have this awesome piece in Slate about why country music is cool again, and I wanted to talk about this. Like I live in Nova Scotia, where there's been a real reemergence of, and maybe it was always here, of like rootsy country music, um, a kind of blending of different genres of country.
Hmm.
You've got bands like Mama's Broke, who I love. The Ordeals plays all the time. Many, many artists like, Trinity Station is playing a show soon. They're a country band. Lots of folk singers, obviously, Old Man Ludica, Alexander Gallant. Um, the thing I find interesting in looking at the scene here is that everybody is really doing their own thing,
Right.
and in this kind of language of country music. And it speaks to your point that, as you say in the article, contrary to many misperceptions, country is far from ideologically monolithic. And this is how you frame the engagement that you this like real deep dive that you do on the contemporary popularity of country music, and I guess in particular this seemingly anomalous tendency among people like Beyonce and like Post Malone to go country at a certain point, and which I think people look at as like a novelty thing, right? And what you say, and I think this is really crucial, is that the reason it's popular is structural. It's not specific to particular artists. You say that it's about country being unshackled from the stranglehold of country radio gatekeepers, that policing of authenticity, I suppose, that characterizes that gatekeeping. Um, and the other thing that I think people, that was so valuable to me, and that I think would be valuable to people that want to just dismiss this shift, is that you point out that it also appeals to offline experience. That there's something about country music that emphasizes and values place, domesticity, and nostalgia. So, do you think country is cool in this kind of two-pronged way, where it's like, on the one hand, it's actually a very online phenomenon where like you just have more accessibility in some ways, and then on the other hand, it's about like a yearning almost for like offline life. I mean, I think it's more the latter here in Nova Scotia, but it's both for you, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, I should say that this article was written a couple of years ago when like
Hmm.
Beyonce put out her country album and Post Malone was putting out his country album. So there was a
That's
particular
right.
moment that I was capturing there that I think has probably changed a little bit since then. But yeah, I mean, the scene that you're describing in Nova Scotia, Nova Scotia has a long, proud history
Hmm.
in country music, Hank
Mm-hmm.
Snow, you know,
Absolutely.
but and also like a very, very rich folk and traditional music base,
Yeah.
and so in some ways, because that music, you know, Celtic music writ large has such a close relationship with how country music evolved, I think there's always going to be that dialogue happening in some place like Nova Scotia in an ongoing way, the way that it does in the American South. Um, and those scenes to some degree operate, nothing's ever fully autonomous from what's happening in the zeitgeist and in the industry, but to some degree, those things carry on no matter what the trends are in one direction or another. And the trends might make it easier for acts like that to draw an audience than it might in a time when the trends are like actively anti-country. But like those bands are probably still going to exist one way or another in some place like Nova Scotia, as they do in Ontario. Um, Toronto has a weird, like, never goes away alt country kind of thing that like sometimes catches on and becomes Blue Rodeo, but otherwise just becomes like a bunch of different people that play weekly at different bars and always will. Um, but yeah, I mean the contradictory move, the the big thing that shifted a few years ago is that um, country had been like the least online form of music for a long time. Like it just had a particular kind of audience that, for lots and lots of reasons, both sort of education and work demographics and all of these kinds of things, didn't tend to be massively online. But as those people's kids started to come of age more, they are online, and suddenly there became, especially during the pandemic, is where the when the shift began to be particularly visible. Because I think also at a time when there were no shows and that kind of thing, even the country audience was like, let me go see what I can find on the internet and figure out what the streaming stuff is. So yeah, country became internet music in a way that it just hadn't been very much before that. And that created an alternative to country radio that hadn't existed. Country radio is still massively important in mainstream country music, but like now there's a counterforce, and country radio has to pay attention to what's getting popular online, and like it can't afford to like completely lag behind that, although it always does to some degree. And so all of that shifted things, and it made people like Beyonce and Post Malone sit up and take notice and think, oh, maybe there's an audience I can find here. Or in Beyonce's case, I think a little bit more. Maybe there's a fight I can have here that it would be an interesting fight for me to have, which is kind of stuff that she's been interested in the past 10 years, going like, I have things to say about black music, and this seems like a way to say it. But yeah, I think there is a countervailing thing that, as the saying goes, touch grass, which is kind of what country has always, to a large degree, been about, even if it's mostly imaginary grass in an imaginary field, and it's like the grass your grandpappy owned, like that kind of thing. And country sells a kind of utopian story about our relationship to the land and that kind of thing that often is, not what is actually going on among the people in Nashville who are spending most of their time on planes and buses touring at stadiums. But still, that's the core story, and it's the story that country music came out of, as this like process of urbanization, whether it's, the field being plowed over and paved over and becoming a city, or whether it's you and your cousins migrating to a city because that's where the work is, and having those fond thoughts about the small towns and farm towns and all of that kind of thing you came from. Like that's a big part of the story of North America, and country is about that story, as like some of soul music is in its own way and that kind of thing. Um, so this conflicted set of feelings we have about being online and about the relationship between having left our like flesh communities behind and moved into these new suburbs of digital avatars. Um, that has a natural kind of relationship to those structures within country music, and I think that's part of why people find it appealing right now.
Yeah, no, I mean it's like this backlash against the metaverse on some level, and like one of my, you know, musical muses, like a guy who runs a cafe in downtown Dartmouth, Brendan Morley. He talks about like the fact that he loves country music because it is a world. He loves the world of country music, and you can absolutely think of it as like almost like a world building genre.
For sure. I mean, it's
Yeah,
kind of, yeah, it's got like a kind of Marvel Universe element to it, right? Because like
sure.
all of these, because of the way Nashville functions as a like central magnet, um, the interconnections between country musicians are just very like deep and constant, um and have rich mythologies around them if you go back through the decades and talk about like sort of the outlaws of the 70s and et cetera, et cetera, back to the honky tonk heroes and all of this kind of thing. Like it has that kind of comic book kind of spread as an epic, and it also has a lot of ugly sides. Like some of those stories are not good stories, but they are stories. And there's an appeal there. But yeah, I mean, like after sort of giving my little sermon about those implicit values in country, like it's also, I think when we talk about it being popular now, we also can't completely discount the side of it that is about a rightward swing in society, and that there is a history that
Mm.
is not at all uniform, as you were quoting me saying, but still is a strong tendency towards a like white Republican center in mainstream country music.
Mm.
And if it's gaining traction now, it's partly probably a little bit to do with at least the destigmatization of that element
Mm.
of country for a lot of the American audience, having like moved a little bit in that direction. So it's like I don't want to paint it
No,
as
yeah.
an unambiguously, you know, hearts and flowers story, but
Oh man, there's a lot of just like, tough cognitive distortion here because like the fact of the matter is fascism has also historically had this connection to the land and to a preservation of it
that's right. Yeah.
that is hard to reckon with, I think, for folks that are more like eco-socialist lefties. It's like, wait a minute, you're saying that they also kind of care about unspoiled nature. How do I reconcile that, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's all really messy. And it might be an interesting segue into thinking about the messiness of protest music, which you've written about as well for Slate. It's a little bit of a shifting of gears, but I think it's related. You say
Closely
basically
related. Yeah.
maybe right. Like I'm trying to like actively work through what what I think is connected, but maybe you can
We
help
just
me with that.
take a left turn through Johnny Cash and
Sure.
you know.
Yeah, that's it. But like in the piece, you're talking about. Of course, there is like a mythos to protest music, right? The troubadours with guitars, usually white, mostly male. The '60s folk and rock mythos. What you're saying is that there are, of course, and this is in some ways occasioned, I think, by, or maybe explicitly, like the Bad Bunny Super Bowl halftime show performance, right? This spectacle, and then Kendrick Lamar the year before. These figures are unbelievably popular and have a lot of cultural power, and yet they don't fit that archetype. And so this occasions the kind of idea, this assumption that like there is not protest music per se today. What was the kind of main motivation in writing that piece? I'd be really curious to hear that.
Yeah, I mean that was an interesting piece because it really started out as one thing and became a different thing.
Mm,
The initial impulse was out of the sort of quick rise to popularity. Again, so sort of modest popularity, but still prominent enough popularity of this singer named Jesse Wells, who over the past couple of years has sort of established himself as like kind of an internet cult figure, um, posting Instagram and YouTube and TikTok videos of himself singing songs that very often were like inspired directly by like the news of the week, you know, like direct responses to things that had been happening. One of the first that was really prominent was after like the Luigi assassination of the healthcare executive. You know, Jesse Wells wrote a song about that, and lots of Trump related things and other things over the course of years, and like also other songs that aren't particularly topical. But like he very much, he could have been if Timothy Chalamet wasn't playing Dylan and a complete unknown like Jesse Wells kind of could. Because he really evoked the image and he would like shoot himself like singing his songs out by a like fence by a stream, in the South. Um, and had this very like Dylan Woody Guthrie kind of style, like it's kind of talking blues or like simple acoustic guitar ditties on political topics with like lots of wordplay. So it appealed to that whole tradition. And I was observing a kind of fight going on among people that I knew and saw online who either were like, oh my God, look, protest music is back. It's so amazing. Or were having a backlash reaction against that and basically saying that he was like a talentless, like con man, that he was like using these symbols of folk authenticity, what we might call like folkism in some ways,
mm,
to
mm-hmm.
like sell himself, and that it
Right.
was a cynical thing on his part. And I
That
felt
made
like
you
it's
want to
like
kind of defend him initially, right?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, like, I felt like both of those things are true. Like, of course, he's trying to market himself.
Sure.
He's
Yeah.
like 30 years old and he'd been a professional musician for 10 years and had a couple of record contracts and nothing had really taken off. And he'd considered giving up music.
Mm.
And then he thought about starting to, like, he moved home and started, like, posting these things on the internet and it took off. And of course, he went with that. So, of course, he has a careerist interest in this as well. And he doesn't have like protester bona fides, just like Dylan didn't, like he's a kid who happened to like hit the moment at the right time and have a thing that people were looking for. But he has talent and he had, and some of those songs I think are good and some of them aren't. But like the idea that that this was all some kind of like confidence game felt like an extremely exaggerated, like authenticity move to me. And I thought the people who were embracing him and not recognizing that, like, pretty evidently, like Kendrick Lamar and Bad Bunny are more important figures of protest music, as you know, have been lots and lots of rappers and musicians in other genres over the past couple of decades, are also missing the story. But so that was the initial idea. And I just wanted to look closely at Jesse Wells and decide what I thought of his music and like just spend some time. Um, but then, as tends to happen when you are moving in this kind of realm, especially in like 2025, 2026, Minneapolis happened, right? And so, and the like Bad Bunny halftime show also happened while I was working on the piece. But like Minneapolis specifically, and like Springsteen's intervention with Streets of Minneapolis, and um, the music that people in Minneapolis were making as being members of the protest music, and the things people were singing on the street, and like kind of like noise making, even as like kind of a, and there's a tradition of that in protest, of like sort of raucous music making that like is itself a kind of sonic protest, whether or not there are like words about it. So all of those things ended up making the piece into like less of a like let's figure out this debate about Jesse Wells, and much more like what is protest music and how does it work, and like what can we expect from it, and what myths do we have around it, and also what can it do, which is like a question. I've been a political person to a degree, and like and a music lover most of my adult life. So I always have this question of like I have an impulse to want music to be political, but I on some level also am like, but does that really do anything? What's the point of that really? Like, does music really change anybody's mind? Or this particular, certainly on its own, this idea like somebody, made a song or an album that changed the world, like that story seems like bullshit to me, but it's a seductive story. And so like I wanted to think about those questions too.
Yeah, it was really helpful for me because like I think I share what you're talking about, which is like lifelong love of music, but also a real desire for like systems change, you know. The trajectory we're on is so destructive for so many people, and
Yeah.
it's like I want those to be braided together. I want my music to somehow change the world. And you quote Billy Bragg, a singer-songwriter that, of course, is avowedly left and who wrote a song in response to Minneapolis that he played here in Halifax when I saw him just recently, literally last week. Not to timestamp this. And, Bragg reiterated what you cite in the article, which is that he does not believe that music itself changes the world. It's there in service of movements. And so even a kind of measured messianism about music is probably a little bit misplaced. And yet I want it. I still want it. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I mean, like what Bragg said, though, to the audience, and it's a version of what he often says about music, is that it can change the world by changing people's attitudes and habits of mind at the very local level. It can remind us that we're not alone in the struggle, which that feels right to me.
Hmm.
And like, I guess like I wanted to bring this into maybe conversation with something that I've written about, which is the music of climate change, the music of climate breakdown. I've written basically that is the value of music. It's if it's valuable, it is about kind of moving us into a place where we do not feel so overwhelmed by the scale of the crisis. Um, And yet, what I found in researching that article I put out is that there's a real problem in some climate music of earnestness, of a kind of ignoring of the importance of like actually having a bit of like an artistic
Yeah.
intention or vision in it. Like, and this so, connects with, I think, what you're arguing in Let's Talk About Love, which is that like few of us, as you say, can afford to be indifferent to cool. And too often, folks like Paul McCartney are just being kind of, they're just showing a level of indifference to cool and putting out these songs that are about just like, well, COP is coming around. We have to write a climate song. Um, so, I guess in terms of the music of Climate Breakdown, what I wonder is how listeners can reconcile that opposition between like aloofness, coolness on the one hand, and earnest expression of concern in a song. Like it's a gamble to take a stand. And so people like Wise Blood will instead talk about how they're trying to do better by not leaving the heat on high or whatever. Like there's an
Right.
obliqueness, right? Do you think that a fear of being earnest is maybe warranted when it comes to trying to communicate concern about climate change in music?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to hear you say that. I think these are good conversations to have. Let me start with the Billy Bragg example because Billy's been um, a really important influence on my thinking about these things over decades. I first discovered him when I was like in my first year of university. And like very shortly after that, he like came to campus and played a show and I interviewed him. So like all of these, and it was at a time when like my thinking about politics was exploding the way that it tends to at that time of life. So he's always been a very important figure for me. And like, I think that what he says about, and I think it's a modesty that he tries to inject into his own practice, having started from a point where he obviously probably had higher hopes and ideals for what could be achieved by making political music and then like going through the process of seeing those ambitions of seeing it become clear that those ambitions were unrealistic and then trying to figure out what his role as a political music maker could be. And so there's a lot of wisdom and experience in the way he talks about it now. But I always think it's a little unfortunate that he kind of leaves out often, unless he gets into further depth, the like initial step of that for him, which was like being like 18 and falling in love with the Clash, right? And like he loved the Clash because they were cool, That was the initial attraction. He loved the music. It was exciting. It was cool. And the Clash had all of this like political statements and references and things that were like kind of cryptic and often not very like straightforwardly programmatic in any way. But that if you were like a Clash fan and you were curious about the world, were like a signpost that could lead you to other places. You could like want to know who the Sandinistas were. You could want all of these kinds of things. You could want to know about the Spanish Civil War. You could like all of these things that are like referenced in one way or another. Um, and that's who Billy Bragg was. Like he was a Clash fan who like then got turned on to Rock Against Racism and then got turned on to the like musical branch of what was happening with the miners' strike, and as a musician like really got his taste of activism that way. And so like that's that attraction of like what culture can do by being full of energy and excitement and not necessarily coherent statements about policy is to me like that's just as important as anything else. But like it is also true that like no song ever started a revolution, and like ultimately the important thing about music is the way that it connects us to both real people around us and to unnamed others that music gives us something in common with at a distance and or up close. And for political activists, it's it can be a comfort, it can be a rallying point, it can be, it can create community, it can be sustaining, all of these things. Um,
Hmm.
so I think that that's true, that that's what and like and protest music, those are the roles that I've mostly see it creating. It's whether it's
Yeah.
something to march to or something to like draw curious people in. Um, what it's least successful at, I think, is preaching to
Yeah.
people and like, and
It's
it's
remarkable
unfortunate
how, yeah.
that's an instinct we have as human beings when we want to do something political. We
Right.
just want to like give people our manifesto
Mm.
in the form of a song, and most of the time that's not compelling music. And
Hmm.
the earnestness is part of it, and part of the like humorlessness, and also like the lack of cool are elements.
Yeah.
And environmentalism is interesting because like
Yeah.
the so many elements that are involved in having that analysis um, are already the stuff of poetry and the stuff of songwriting, right? Like it's like a relationship to the natural world is always there in art making, and less so in the modern world than it used to be, but still important. And so like I look at throughout the Toronto artist, the Weather Station's career, and like this has always been important to her as part of what she was writing about. But she, as Billy always has, she like mixes it poetically with like concerns about love and about life and aging and all of these things, and doesn't she never treats the climate crisis in isolation, and she's not trying to give a paper at cop. It's like she's trying to like bring that feeling out of her listeners, of just living in relationship to those questions and those concerns. um and that seems more, I look this for angry songs about specific situations and that kind of thing too. There's a great song by this American singer songwriter named Joe B. Riccio from last year called Wildfire Season, which is just basically about how weird it is that we now have a fire season every year where like vast swaths of the continent burn, and like just living in a time when that's true. And like that song, like fucking, it's musically beautiful and just like intense and quietly angry in a way that like just connects with that feeling of like, yeah, I also feel that it's fucked up that this is the world that we live in now. And like I love how it stops just for short of being explicit and like making any kind of like political argument about it. It just it trusts the listener. That's a big thing too. It's like it trusts the
Mm.
listener to
Hmm.
be able to like connect the dots.
Yeah.
And that that really helps prevent music from being, or any art from being off-putting, right? It's like it's not talking down to you. It's like meeting
Mm.
you on
Hmm.
a peer-to-peer level.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's amazing. Like, and I love that you mentioned the Weather Station and Tamara Lindemann's just incredible album, Ignorance, which I think is like for me the most accomplished record about climate change or climate grief, maybe more specifically. But we've also got here in Canada, Winter Sleeps America, which is just a really beautiful, defiant statement about where we're at and that feeling of
Mm.
like, is it just a waste of time? Like, what are we doing?
Yeah, and
But yeah.
I'd also say like Tanya Tagaq's work,
Oh my God, yeah,
which is
yeah.
about the North in a time of climate change,
Oh man,
among
yeah.
other things, and like
Leanne
and like
Simpson
that.
also,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Leanne Simpson, I think, leans a little more in that earnest direction sometimes in ways that
It's true.
I mean, I like her, but like I do feel that sometimes. But like Tagak's work is so challenging sonically and all of those kinds of
Hmm.
things, but
Hmm.
like it brings you into the landscape in this way,
Right.
right?
Yeah, a song about oil. Like she's writing a song about oil, which is, so unique. I don't know. I mean, I could talk forever about these things, and you've been so generous with your time already. I don't want to take too much more of it. Thanks for that recommendation, though. I'll look that song up because yes, it is unbelievably fucked up that the world is on fire. You look at Utah, you look at California, like these are parts of the world that are on fire. Europe, all of France is right now
Yeah.
under wildfire advisory. They are baking, and
Yeah, and this just didn't used to happen every
did
year,
not used
you
to happen.
know?
For music to not notice it and to not
Yeah,
try and give voice to it would be odd.
yeah.
But yeah, no, I want to let you go, but I want to ask one more question about the job that you do. You've already kind of pointed to some of the challenges around, still in a way like just trying to still have an impact, just as a writer, like
Hmm.
still, um, there's an appetite for certain kinds of writing. I think right now, the zero click zero sum game is leading to a real algorithmic reduction. It feels like of where writing is at, but your writing and the writing of folks that you cite in your poptimism article gives me hope. Honestly, that there is still really room for writing that negotiates these editorial imperatives that you've talked about. The imperatives for, you say, like lists and hyperbolic claims. Like you're still writing list, best of lists at the end of the year, and you're still making
Hmm.
bold claims. But do you still feel like you have space to meet people where they are, which is, I think, still a passionate attachment to music and a desire for thought pieces on music's persistent power to give us a sense of connection, to give us, access to stories and other experiences and emotions that, like, we wouldn't have access to otherwise.
I mean, yes and no. Um,
Right.
I, I really passionately believe that the kinds of conversations that we can have through arts criticism are valuable, and um, they've been valuable to me all my life, and I'm kind of, you know, it's just something about the way that my brain works that I find, and some people are completely the opposite, but I find kind of art incomplete until I get to delve into what other people think about it and people who might know more than me about what its relationship to other work is and all of these kinds of things. But even just like I'm a little addicted to watching reactor videos for TV shows that I like just because I'm like I love hearing people talk about stuff that we enjoy. Um, so I'll never give up on that. Um, and I think the thing that impulse has given rise to, throughout cultural history is also like a rich literary form. It's a way of writing about the world through art that I think has a lot to offer to readers, as much as lots and lots of other ways. It's like travel writing or anything else that it can be much more than the sort of thing that it says on the label. It's I don't want to read just I don't want to read about somebody's trip to Algeria just because I like want to know what the best hotels are. I want to know what it's like there and how it changed them and all of these things and what they learned. And music writing and art writing and all of these things can do the same things. Especially, I think we're in a good era in the sense that um, the crisis of authority that the internet's brought on encourages critics to speak more personally in ways that I think can be really rich. Um, the difficulty is finding a readership for any of that and competing against the media forms that grab all the attention, and nobody knows how to pay for things anymore. And I've got a newsletter, which is carlwilson.substack.com, by the way, that like I partly try to like keep some of that alive with, to write about things that I might not be able to write about for money from other places, and like try to get newsletter readers to help sustain me a little bit in doing that work, and making a two-way exchange that way. So you try and throw yourself at it as much as you can. And and I think people still read books to some degree. So, I'm working on getting to a new book. And, I feel like, particularly at this phase in my career, that's like the most promising direction to move. But I also think like we're just in the middle of a huge shift. Like, who knows if we're nearing the end of the shift or what we're in. But like, I do feel like, particularly for like people in their teens and 20s right now, like there's a lot of distractions online that and in the world that may make this a little slow to emerge. But I think similarly to when the sort of boomers reinvented cultural criticism when they were young, I suspect that that's going to happen with that generation of people. They're going to find new forms. The smart people there are going to like take what people are doing in like primitive forms on YouTube and TikTok and stuff right now and like move it somewhere. And hopefully it'll still involve writing in a lot of ways. Um, but it's going to have to find the way that works in the culture that we're moving into, unless we're not moving into a culture and we're moving into, AI and climate change collaborating to end everything. But if that's not the case, I think there'll be time for some kind of renaissance in all this. I don't think I'm necessarily going to be a part of that. So I need to figure out things to do with my remaining years as a critic, my remaining decades. But like, because it, it's, I, it's even the idea of like doing direct address to camera is like difficult for me to wrap my head around. I'd much rather, I've developed these skills of the ways that I write and talk over decades. And like, it's very difficult to go like, oh, I have to throw all that out and do something else. Like, I don't want to do that. I'd rather find other ways to make a living and still persist in doing the work that I want to do in the way I want to do it for the most part. Although if anybody has ideas, get in touch. but, but yeah, I am optimistic because I think the impulse that criticism comes out of, the good criticism comes out of, is a deeply human cultural thing. And if we have the freedom and the means to do it, we'll find a way to do it that speaks to the culture we live in.
Yeah. That's perfect. And like the thing you mentioned about like AI and so on, it reminded me of like I'm reading this book by John Warner right now called More Than Words. And he basically, I mean, he is celebrating the continued value of writing as thinking, writing as feeling, without like romanticizing. He's like, yeah, okay, ChatGPT, brilliant bullshitter, really, really good at probabilistic simulation of writing. But what it does is not writing, actually, because there's no intention, there's no feeling, there's no, right? And I don't
for
know,
certain purposes, I think we have to face the fact that it's going to be good at some things,
right?
But criticism is one of those things where I'm like, yeah, it can make up some critical sounding, sentences about things, but like I think we actually care as we do about like, I don't think AI, it's going to be there more than we probably want, but like even in popular music, I think the amount that AI can be used is limited because still what audiences want, I think, is to feel some kind of connection with other people. And they don't want it to feel like it's not a person creating this. Our window for how these tools get used and what counts as, authentic in these cases may shift some. That all might happen. And I feel like it's the same with criticism. Like I feel like the reader wants, or the viewer or listener wants to feel like they're experiencing what another human being experienced in relation to this thing, and like comparing notes. And I don't think AI can satisfactorily stand in for that.
Yeah, well said. Wow, this has been just really wonderful being able to talk to you about this stuff. I appreciate you making the time, and everybody should absolutely follow your newsletter. It's you'll find out about all kinds of wonderful music, but I like its situated quality. Right? You know, you were just at this really interesting music festival in Hamilton, which is like my old stomping grounds.
Oh,
So wonderful, wonderful talking to you, and thanks so much for your writing.
thank you so much for these questions. It was a really good conversation. Thank you.